The temperature dropped without warning. It was somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning on a January night in 1881, deep in the high plains of Montana Territory, when the last remnants of a fading Chinook gave way to a wall of Arctic air rolling south from Canada. Within 4 hours, the thermometer outside the Caldwell General Store, the only one in the settlement of Harrow Creek, had fallen from 28 degrees Fahrenheit minus 2 degrees Celsius to a recorded low of minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit minus 37 degrees Celsius. Local accounts describe it as the coldest night anyone in the valley could remember. Every cabin in Harrow Creek was burning wood, not gently, not efficiently, burning through the way a drowning man burns through air, fast, desperate, without calculation. Families were awake. Children were pressed against whatever heat source existed. Wives stoked fires that had no business dying, and husbands split emergency wood in the dark by lantern light, their breath hanging in clouds that froze before they hit the ground. In one cabin on the eastern edge of the settlement, a man named Ewan McKittrick had been asleep for 3 hours. His fire had gone cold 2 hours before that. Not low cold. The firebox held nothing but gray ash and the faint smell of spent pine. No ember, no glow, no heat being generated anywhere in that cabin. And yet, when his neighbor Donald Ferris, half frozen and desperate, pounding on every door in the settlement looking for extra wood, pushed open Ewan's door expecting to find a man in crisis, he stopped in the doorway and stood very still. It was warm inside, not blazing, not oppressively hot, but warm the way a stone building holds warmth in late summer, a deep, radiating, ambient warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Ferris later described it to a circuit preacher passing through in the spring. It felt like walking into a barn where animals had been sleeping. The heat was in the walls. The heat was in the floor. It came from that pillar in the middle of the room like a living thing. The pillar. That was what everyone in Harrow Creek had spent the previous 18 months laughing about. Before we reveal exactly what Ewan built and why it worked when everything around it failed, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We have more stories like this one, forgotten engineering from the frontier, that still holds lessons for anyone living off the grid today. Don't miss them. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Harrow Creek did not appear on any territorial map until 1879. Before that, it was simply a convergence, a place where 3 families had chosen to winter within half a mile of each other, close enough to the creek for water, close enough to a limestone ridge to the north for modest wind protection. By the time the settlement had a name, it had 11 structures, 8 homestead cabins, a supply shed that doubled as a trading post, a smithy, and a small structure used for meetings and, in summer, as a classroom. The land itself was unforgiving in ways that are difficult to convey from a distance of a century and a half. Montana Territory in the late 1870s sat in a climate band that produced short, punishing winters with little of the snowpack insulation that softened conditions further east. The high plains offered no natural windbreak, except what the settlers built themselves. Continental air masses from Canada moved south across open ground with nothing to slow them. Average winter temperatures in the region hover between 10 degrees Fahrenheit and 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 12 degrees Celsius to minus 7 degrees Celsius, for 3 to 4 months, with cold snaps regularly pushing below minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius for days at a stretch. Timber was scarce. This is the detail that most modern accounts of frontier life fail to communicate adequately. The romantic image of the frontier cabin, hewn logs, thick walls, a roaring hearth, masks a fundamental resource problem. The trees available at Harrow Creek's elevation were primarily lodgepole pine, straight useful, but not abundant enough to supply a growing settlement indefinitely. An experienced woodsman at the time estimated the accessible timber within a 2-mile radius of the settlement at roughly 400 to 500 cords, enough for perhaps 5 to 7 winters of consumption at the rate families were burning. After that, the settlement would be hauling wood from significantly greater distances, or relocating. It was into this landscape, cold, dry, windswept, and timber poor, that a man named Ewan McKittrick arrived in late September of 1879, traveling alone with 2 mules, a set of stonemason's tools wrapped in oilcloth, and a particular way of looking at rock. He had come from the western counties of Scotland as a young man, spent a decade working stone in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and had drifted west following the rhythm of settlement. He was not, by any account, a charismatic man. He spoke little, charged fair prices, and was known among the families of Harrow Creek primarily for the quality of his hearth and foundation work. His stonework held. That was a reputation. In a world where foundations shifted and chimneys cracked, the quiet Scotsman built things that held. He was 41 years old when he began building his own cabin in the fall of 1879. And from the moment he started, people thought he was making a mistake. To understand what Ewan McKittrick saw, you have to understand what everyone else was doing and why it wasn't working. The standard frontier cabin of the Northern Plains in the 1870s and 1880s was a product of speed, necessity, and the materials immediately at hand. Walls were typically hewn or round logs, notched at the corners, with gaps chinked using a mixture of mud, moss, animal hair, and occasionally lime when available. Roofs were either sod-covered pole frames or split-shake shingles laid over rough boards. Windows were small, sometimes just oil paper or scraped animal hide stretched over a frame, because glass was expensive and heat loss through glazing was already understood to be significant. The fireplace was almost always positioned against an exterior wall. This was a convention. It was a design settlers knew from their origins in the eastern states and in Europe. A stone or brick firebox set into the wall, a mantel, a chimney rising straight up to the roofline. Practical, familiar, and, as Ewan had come to understand through years of observing fires and the people who fed them, profoundly wasteful. The physics of a conventional wall fireplace are not kind to the room it is supposed to heat. The firebox draws air from inside the cabin to feed combustion. That same combustion produces hot gases that rise rapidly up the chimney, carry with them the majority of the thermal energy generated by the burning wood. Studies of traditional open-hearth designs, later confirmed by heating engineers in the early 20th century, suggest that between 70% and 85% of the heat energy produced by an open fireplace exits through the chimney. The room receives a remainder, some radiant heat from the firebox opening, some conducted heat through whatever masonry exists in the surround, and very little stored heat at all, because the stone mass involved in a typical wall fireplace is modest, usually no more than 200 to 400 pounds of material, and it cools rapidly once the fire dies. In practical terms, this meant that the frontier family's relationship with warmth was a relationship with active combustion. The moment the fire went low, the room began to cool. The moment the fire went out, for sleep, for errands, for the simple exhaustion of feeding it through the night, the cabin temperature dropped toward ambient. In a Montana winter, ambient can mean a cabin interior of 20 degrees Fahrenheit minus 7 degrees Celsius or lower by morning if the fire had been out for 6 hours. And so the wood burned and burned. Estimates from settler journals of the period, compiled by regional historians, suggest that a family of four in a standard cabin of 300 to 400 square feet, 28 to 37 square meters, might consume between 8 and 12 cords of firewood over a single Montana winter. A cord, a stack of split wood measuring 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet, roughly 1.2 by 1.2 by 2.4 meters, represents an enormous amount of labor, felling, limbing, bucking, splitting, hauling, stacking. Multiplied across 11 households, Harrow Creek was burning through its timber supply with a speed that made the back of the envelope math genuinely alarming. Ewan McKittrick understood this. He had understood it for years, and he had also understood, in the patient, empirical way of a man who worked with stone every day, that rock had a memory for heat that wood did not. There is a moment that Ewan's neighbor Cecily Branthorpe, one of the few settlers in Harrow Creek who kept a written record of her first years in the territory, described in a letter to her sister in Ohio, dated the autumn of 1879. She wrote that she had watched the stonemason sitting on a flat limestone outcropping near the creek on a cool September afternoon. Long after the sun had moved off it, she assumed he was resting. Then she realized he had his palm pressed flat against the stone, just sitting there, hand on rock, eyes somewhere else entirely. She asked him what he was doing. Feeling how long it remembers, he said. She did not understand what he meant. Most people in Harrow Creek didn't, not then, but what Ewan was measuring, crudely, intuitively, with the palm of a stonemason's hand, was thermal mass. the capacity of a dense material to absorb heat energy, hold it, and release it slowly back into the surrounding air long after the original heat source has gone cold. The principle is not complicated, though the terminology was not yet widely known on the frontier. Dense, heavy materials, stone, brick, compressed earth, water, absorb large quantities of heat energy before their surface temperature changes significantly. This is called high thermal mass. Once they are fully heated, they release that energy slowly and steadily, acting as a buffer between the sharp fluctuations of an active fire and the ambient temperature of the surrounding space. A properly sized and positioned mass of stone can continue radiating useful heat for 6 to 12 hours or more after the fire that charge it has died entirely. Wood, by contrast, and by extension, the thin log walls of standard frontier cabin has very low thermal mass. It absorbs heat quickly and loses it just as quickly. It is a poor buffer. It offers insulation against conducted heat loss through the wall, but it stores almost nothing. Ewan had learned this not from books, though he had read what technical literature he could acquire, including translated excerpts from the work of Swedish and Finnish builders circulating in the masonry trades, but from stone itself, from pressing his hand against sun-warmed limestone at dusk and feeling the warmth still present 2 hours after sunset, from noticing that the stone walls of the old estate buildings in Scotland stayed cool in summer and warm in winter in a way that wooden structures simply did not, from watching, over decades of work, how a well-built stone hearth surround changed the behavior of a room compared to one built with minimal masonry. He had a theory, and the theory was this. If a wall fireplace was wasteful because most of its heat escaped up the chimney, and whatever masonry involved was too small to store meaningful energy, then the solution was not to build a better wall fireplace. The solution was to build the mass itself, a large, central column of dense stone with the firebox contained within it, positioned at the geometric center of the living space, so that every surface of the mass radiated heat in all directions simultaneously, and the mass itself was large enough to store many hours' worth of thermal energy from a single fire. Not a fireplace against the wall. A pillar, a thermal engine made of stone, standing in the middle of the room. When he laid out the footprint for his cabin in October of 1879, and the neighbors came to see, the first thing anyone noticed was the size of the stone foundation he had marked at the center of the floor plan. Roughly 4 feet by 4 feet, approximately 1.2 by 1.2 meters, set perfectly equidistant from all 4 walls of the planned structure. Rufus Caldwell, who ran the trading post and considered himself the most practically experienced builder in the settlement, walked the outline twice, and then looked at Ewan. "What in God's name," he said, "is that supposed to be?" Ewan told him. Caldwell looked at the other men who had gathered. Then he looked back at the stonemason. "That," he said, "is the single most useless thing I have ever seen a man plan to put inside a house." Nobody disagreed. Ewan McKittrick broke ground on his cabin foundation in the second week of October 1879, with the first hard frost already whitening the grass each morning and the smell of coming snow sitting low in the air over the creek. He worked methodically. That was the word Cecily Branthorpe used in her letters. Methodically. Not fast. Not dramatically. He moved the way a man moves when he's thought about something for a long time and no longer needs to think about it in the doing. Every stone chosen, every joint packed with a mortar, he mixed himself from local lime, sand, and a small measure of animal fat to slow the curing in cold weather. The foundation of the cabin went in first. A perimeter of flat limestone set 2 feet, roughly 60 centimeters, into the ground to get below the frost line and prevent seasonal heaving. Standard enough work, the kind that earned him his reputation. But then came the central mass. The pillar Ewan built was not a chimney in the conventional sense, though it contained one. It was at its core a freestanding thermal engine, a rectangular column of dense limestone and sandstone measuring approximately 4 feet wide by 3 feet deep, 1.2 by 0.9 meters, at its base, rising from a reinforced section of the floor foundation to a height of roughly 7 feet, 2.1 meters, before transitioning into the chimney flue that carried combustion gases through the roof. The total estimated weight of the completed structure was between 3,800 and 4,200 pounds, nearly 2 tons of carefully selected, tightly fitted stone sitting at the geometric center of a cabin floor that measured 16 by 18 feet, 4.9 by 5.5 meters. The firebox itself was modest by the standards of a wall fireplace, intentionally so. Ewan understood that a large, roaring firebox encouraged fast combustion and rapid heat transfer to flue gas, which meant more heat escaping upward. He wanted the opposite, a smaller, controlled burn that transferred its energy slowly and thoroughly into the surrounding stone mass rather than launching it up the chimney. The firebox opening measured approximately 18 inches wide by 14 inches tall, 46 by 36 centimeters, fitted with a cast iron door he had sourced from a hardware supplier in Billings. The flue was narrow and tall, nearly 9 feet 2.7 meters of internal chimney height before the cap, which created a strong natural draft while keeping the exhaust gases in contact with the stone mass long enough to surrender a significant portion of their heat before escaping. This was the mechanism. Hot combustion gases, instead of rising freely through a wide-mouthed fireplace and exiting at high temperature, were forced through a long, narrow passage surrounded on all sides by dense stone. The stone absorbed that heat. The gases that finally reached the chimney cap were noticeably cooler than what would exit a conventional wall fireplace, a sign, to anyone who understood it, that the energy had stayed inside rather than venting into the sky. Around the firebox, Ewan selected his stone with deliberate care. The inner layers, the courses directly surrounding the firebox and flue, were built from a dense, fine-grained sandstone he had located in a cut bank along the eastern edge of the creek. Sandstone of that type has a volumetric heat capacity of roughly 0.3 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. At an estimated 1,200 pounds of sandstone in the inner mass, a fire that raised the core temperature of the pillar by 200 degrees Fahrenheit, 93 degrees Celsius above ambient, would store approximately 72,000 BTU of thermal energy, enough, in a well-insulated cabin of his dimensions, to maintain a livable interior temperature of 55 degrees Fahrenheit to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius to 18 degrees Celsius, for 7 to 10 hours after the fire had been allowed to die completely. Ewan did not write these numbers down. He did not need to. He had arrived at the same conclusion through years of observation and the accumulated instinct of a man who had spent his adult life understanding how stone behaved under heat. He knew what he was building. He knew it would work. What he could not fully anticipate was the patience it would require to let the pillar prove itself, and the winter it would take to silence the men who had been laughing since the foundation went in. By the time Ewan's cabin was closed in and the pillar stood finished at its center, the commentary in Harrow Creek had settled into something between amusement and genuine concern. Rufus Caldwell had made his position clear from the beginning, and he returned to it with the regularity of a man who enjoys being right in public. The pillar took up floor space. That was his primary argument, and it was not entirely without merit. In a 16 by 18-foot cabin, a central structure 4 feet wide occupied a meaningful percentage of the living area. Caldwell calculated, loudly and in front of an audience of the Trading Post one November afternoon, that Ewan had sacrificed roughly 12 square feet of usable floor to a column of rock that, in his estimation, would heat nothing more effectively than the wall fireplaces in every other cabin in the settlement. "You've built yourself a monument," he said, "a monument to stubbornness." The other experienced builder in the settlement was a man named Gideon Holst, who had constructed 3 of the cabins in Harrow Creek and considered himself well-versed in the practical demands of frontier winter. Holst's objection was more technical, and in the context of what most people knew at the time, it was not unreasonable. He argued that the small firebox opening was a mistake, that a fire needed room to breathe, that restricting the combustion chamber would result in incomplete burning, smoke problems, and insufficient heat output. He had seen small stoves struggle in cold weather and assumed Ewan's design would do the same. "When that box chokes," Holst told a group of men outside the smithy, "and it will choke, he'll be tearing half that pillar down to rebuild the firebox. Mark my words." A third voice came from an unexpected direction. The circuit preacher who had wintered at Harrow Creek, a man named Reverend Adair, raised what he called a safety concern. A freestanding column of heated stone at the center of a wooden floor, he argued, was a fire hazard. If the stone cracked under thermal stress, which stone, he assured anyone listening, absolutely could do, burning material could fall onto the floorboards. He delivered this warning with the quiet gravity of a man accustomed to having his warnings taken seriously. None of these men were fools. Caldwell understood cabin construction. Holst had built structures that survived Montana winters. Reverend Adair had seen fire take frontier buildings with terrible speed. Their objections were rooted in real experience and genuine concern. What they lacked, what almost everyone in Harrow Creek lacked, was a specific, layered knowledge of thermal mass behavior that Ewan had accumulated over 20 years of working stone in varied climates and conditions. Ewan's responses to their criticisms were brief and consistent. To Caldwell, the floor space loss of the pillar was recovered in firewood not cut, not hauled, not split. To Holst, the draft characteristics of a tall, narrow flue compensated entirely for the smaller firebox opening, and he had tested the design in miniature before committing to full scale. To Reverend Adair, the pillar sat on its own reinforced foundation, thermally isolated from the floor framing by a bed of packed sand and flat stone, and the sandstone selected for the inner courses had been cured slowly through controlled test fires over 6 weeks before the cabin was even closed in, a process specifically intended to drive out moisture and reduce the risk of thermal cracking. Nobody found these answers satisfying. They sounded too careful, too prepared. Frontier builders trusted what they had done before, what they had seen work, what their hands already knew. A stonemason describing flue draft ratios and thermal expansion properties was speaking a language that sounded, to most ears in Harrow Creek, like the language of a man trying too hard to defend a bad decision. And so the winter of 1879 came in, and Ewan McKittrick lit his pillar for the first time, and the settlement watched and waited and fully expected, by February, to hear that he had torn it out. The winter of 1880 to 1881 is recorded in territorial weather accounts as one of the harshest that northern Montana experienced in the latter half of the 19th century. The cold came early, a sustained freeze settling in by mid-November, and it did not release its grip until late March. What made it particularly brutal was not the single coldest night, though January 1881 delivered temperatures that dropped to minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 37 degrees Celsius, and held there for nearly 40 hours. What made it brutal was a relentlessness. Week after week of temperatures that rarely climbed above 10 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 12 degrees Celsius during the daylight hours, accompanied by winds out of the north that stripped heat from any surface not fully sheltered. Every cabin in Harrow Creek was tested. All of them held their occupants alive. Not all of them held them warm. Gideon Holst's cabin, well built by conventional standards, with a substantial wall fireplace and tight chinking, required an estimated 11 cords of wood to carry a family of 4 through that winter, based on a supply record Holst kept in a ledger that survived in the possession of his descendants. The interior temperature in the main room, measured on several occasions by Cecily Branthorpe using a mercury thermometer she had brought from Ohio, dropped to between 38 degrees Fahrenheit and 44 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius to 7 degrees Celsius, on the coldest mornings after the overnight fire had burned down. Holst's family woke each morning to cold floors, frosted window coverings, and a fire that needed rebuilding from near nothing. Rufus Caldwell's cabin ran through approximately 10 cords over the same period. His family reported similar morning temperatures. Ewan McKittrick burned between 5 and 6 cords of wood over the entire winter. That figure, roughly half the consumption of his nearest neighbor, was a number that silenced the trading post arguments more effectively than any technical explanation Ewan had ever offered. But the temperature record was equally striking. On the morning following the worst cold snap of January 1881, the night Donald Ferris had pounded on every door in the settlement looking for wood, Cecily recorded the interior temperature of Ewan's cabin at 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius. The fire in the pillar had been cold for 6 hours. The stone was still releasing the heat it had absorbed during a moderate evening fire the night before, radiating steadily outward from the central mass, warming the air at the floor of the walls, the sleeping loft above. The physics were exactly what Ewan had described. The central position meant that no surface of the pillar faced a cold exterior wall. The radiated heat moved directly into the living space, rather than being partially lost to the wall behind a conventional fireplace. The large mass, nearly 2 tons of dense stone, had absorbed enough thermal energy from a 3-hour evening fire to maintain a meaningful temperature differential above ambient for 7 to 9 hours after combustion ended. The narrow firebox and tall flue had produced a clean, controlled burn with minimal smoke, and critically, had transferred a far higher percentage of each fire's energy into stone rather than up the chimney. Later estimates, based on the exhaust temperature designs of this type, suggest that between 60% and 75% of the thermal energy generated by each fire was retained in the stone mass, compared to 15% to 30% typically retained by a conventional open-wall fireplace of the era. Donald Ferris did not need a percentage to understand what he had felt when he pushed open that door at 3 in the morning. He had felt it with his face. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, long enough that the cold outside began pulling the warm air inside, and Ewan, now awake, told him to either come in or close the door. Ferris came in. He sat down near the pillar and pressed his palm against the stone the way he had seen Ewan do on the limestone outcropping 2 years before, and he held it there for a long time. The stone was warm. Not hot, not scorching. Warm, steady, and patient. The way a living thing holds warmth, rather than the sharp, immediate heat of an open fire. "I owe you an apology," Ferris said. Ewan handed him a cup of water from the bucket that had not frozen overnight. "You owe me nothing," he said, "but come spring, I'll show you how to build one." By the following autumn, 3 families in Harrow Creek had rebuilt or significantly modified their heating systems. Donald Ferris was first, working alongside Ewan through August and September of 1881 to tear out his wall fireplace and construct a central thermal mass pillar of his own, slightly smaller than Ewan's original, at an estimated 3,200 pounds of combined sandstone and limestone, but positioned at the center of his cabin floor with the same logic governing every dimension. Gideon Holst followed by October, doing most of the work himself with Ewan's guidance, though he quietly declined to acknowledge in public that he had changed his position. The Ferris cabin's first full winter on the new system consumed just over 5 cords of wood. Holst, with a slightly larger interior volume, used approximately 6.5. Rufus Caldwell did not rebuild. He was not, by temperament, a man who found it easy to unmake a public opinion. But oral accounts passed down to the Caldwell family suggest that he visited Ewan's cabin on a cold February evening in 1882, stayed for nearly 2 hours, and left without saying much. The following spring, he recommended Ewan's stonework, specifically and without qualification, to a family settling for miles north of Harrow Creek. Whether that recommendation included a description of the pillar design, no one recorded. The technique itself spread the way most practical frontier knowledge spread, not through documents or formal instruction, but through the hands and eyes of people who had seen it work. A mason from the Judith Basin region passing through Harrow Creek in the summer of 1882 examined Ewan's pillar in detail, and is said to have built variations of design into at least 5 structures over the following 3 years, based on accounts collected by a regional historian working from homestead records in the early 20th century. The design was never patented. It was never given a formal name in the settlement. People in Harrow Creek simply called it McKittrick's Pillar, in the flat, matter-of-fact way that frontier communities name things after the person stubborn enough to prove they worked. The broader principle, thermal mass as a primary heating strategy rather than an afterthought, was not new when Ewan built his pillar. Variations of the concept had existed across many cultures and centuries. The Russian masonry stove, known as the pechka, which had been heating homes across Eastern Europe and Siberia for generations using exactly this logic. The Finnish Varavataka, a soapstone accumulator stove that could maintain warmth for 12 to 18 hours on a single fire. The Korean Ondal floor heating system, which used stone channels beneath the floor to distribute and store heat from a single firebox. The Airori hearth of rural Japan, set into the floor and surrounded by heavy stone to moderate temperature through the night. Each of these solutions had arrived at the same understanding by different paths and in different materials, that the enemy of winter warmth is not insufficient fire, but insufficient mass, that the problem with most heating systems is not how much heat they generate, but how quickly that heat disappears. That stone, dense, patient, slow to heat and slow to cool, is not a primitive material. It is a thermal battery. And a thermal battery, correctly sized and positioned, changes the entire relationship between a family and a winter. What Ewan McKittrick understood, and what Rufus Caldwell, Gideon Holst, and most of Harrow Creek did not, until the winter of 1881 made it impossible to argue otherwise, was not a secret. It was not even particularly complex. It was the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands of people who work closely with materials, who pay attention to how things behave over time rather than in the moment, who measure their results not in how hot a fire burns, but in how warm a room stays after the fire is gone. That knowledge was old when Ewan was born. It will be old when we are gone. But there is something in the story of a quiet stonemason pressing his palm against warm limestone in a September field, measuring, calculating, imagining the structure he would build, and the winter would outlast. That feels worth remembering, not as nostalgia, not as a rejection of everything modern building has learned, but as a reminder that the solutions to hard problems are not always new ones, and that the people history forgot to record were sometimes the ones who understood things most clearly. The pillars still stood in 1903, according to a traveler's account cited in a regional newspaper archive. By then, the settlement had grown and changed around it, and the cabin had passed through two other families' hands. The traveler noted, in passing, that the interior of the cabin was noticeably warmer than the temperature outside warranted, and that the stone column at the center of the room appeared to be the source. He did not know whose hands had built it. He did not know the name of the man who had sat on a limestone outcropping in the autumn of 1879, pressing his palm flat against a rock and feeling how long it remembered, but he felt the warmth, and that, in the end, was the point. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about the weight of that stone, the patience of that man, or the warmth that outlasted the fire, then like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us which part of this story surprised you most. We have more of these forgotten engineering, overlooked builders, solutions that worked not because they were modern, but because they understood something true about the physical world. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The frontier had more secrets than one quiet stonemason, and we are just getting started. Educational disclaimer. This video features frontier-inspired narratives created for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, personal stories, names, and specific situations portrayed are fictional reconstructions. However, many of the building methods, survival concepts, and practical ideas discussed are inspired by real historical techniques, traditional practices, and basic physical principles used in past frontier environments. Any modern use of these ideas should be carefully evaluated according to current safety standards, building codes, regulations, and professional guidance. This content is intended for educational and historical interest only and should not be considered professional, technical, or legal advice.